In 1967, a woman driving through the middle of California's Death Valley stopped because her car had a flat tire. She expected to spend a few minutes waiting for repairs. Instead, she discovered an abandoned theater in a nearly deserted desert settlement and made a decision that seemed completely unreasonable. She would bring the theater back to life. For decades, she performed there, even when almost nobody came to watch. And when the seats remained empty, she did something extraordinary. She painted an audience on the walls so she would never have to perform to an empty room. The forgotten theater of Death Valley Junction would eventually become one of America's strangest surviving cultural landmarks, carrying a quiet lesson about the dreams people protect even when nobody else seems to understand them. The story began much earlier, in the early 20th century, when Death Valley Junction was not simply a lonely desert stop, but a working community connected to the borax industry and the railroad. In 1923, the Pacific Coast Borax Company constructed a Spanish colonial revival-style complex at Death Valley Junction that included housing and a community hall. The settlement existed because workers and transportation were needed in one of the harshest environments in the United States. Accidentally Wes Anderson. The desert surrounding the community was unforgiving. Summers could become brutally hot. Water was precious. The landscape stretched toward distant mountains, with enormous areas of empty land separating settlements from one another. Yet people still built a community there. Workers needed places to live. Families needed somewhere to gather. People needed entertainment, conversation, and moments when life could feel normal. The community hall eventually included a theater space. But the prosperity that created Death Valley Junction did not last forever. By the middle of the 20th century, the original industrial activity had declined. The railroad that had once connected the settlement to the outside world was eventually removed. Buildings that had once served workers and families became increasingly quiet. The desert began reclaiming the place. Then, in 1967, something completely unexpected happened. A ballet dancer and artist named Marta Becket was traveling through the region with her husband when their car suffered a flat tire near Death Valley Junction. While waiting for the repair, Becket noticed the old abandoned building. She walked toward it. Inside was a neglected theater. There were no crowds, no bustling town, no thriving entertainment district, just an old stage sitting in a nearly forgotten desert settlement. Most people might have looked at the building and seen a dying place. Becket saw something else. She imagined a theater, a real theater, a place where she could perform. The idea was almost absurd. Who would come? Why would anyone travel into the desert to watch a ballet? And how could a theater survive in a place where almost nobody lived? But Becket decided to try. Beginning in 1968, she transformed the abandoned community hall into what became known as the Amargosa Opera House. She performed there for decades, turning the forgotten building into a unique cultural destination in the middle of the desert. Accidentally Wes Anderson. But there was a problem. Sometimes there was almost nobody in the audience. Imagine standing beneath stage lights, wearing a costume, preparing to perform, and looking into rows of empty seats. For many performers, that would have been heartbreaking. For Becket, it became a challenge. If the real audience would not come, she would create one. She began painting figures on the walls and ceiling of the theater. Royal-looking characters, elegant spectators, people dressed in colorful clothing. She created an imaginary audience that appeared to sit inside the theater and watch her performances. The result was extraordinary. The walls became filled with painted spectators. The theater no longer felt completely empty. Even when the real seats contained few people, Becket could look around and see the audience she had created. Her paintings eventually became one of the most distinctive features of the Amargosa Opera House. Accidentally Wes Anderson. But the story was never simply about paintings. It was about persistence. Death Valley Junction was not a booming city. There were no huge crowds waiting outside. There was no guarantee that the theater would succeed. There was no obvious business reason for a performer to remain there. Yet Becket continued. She performed, she painted, she maintained the theater. And slowly the strange little place began attracting attention. People who heard about the desert theater became curious. Why would a professional performer choose such an isolated location? Why were there painted spectators on the walls? Why had someone spent years creating beauty in a place where the surrounding community had nearly disappeared? The answers were connected to something deeper than entertainment. The theater became a symbol of refusing to let an abandoned place become completely lifeless. Around it, Death Valley Junction remained tiny. The old building stood beneath the enormous desert sky. The original industrial world that had created the settlement was long gone. The railroad was gone. The crowds were gone. Much of the original purpose of the community had disappeared. Yet the theater remained. And that contrast made the place extraordinary. Outside the building was silence. Inside was color. Outside was desert. Inside were painted faces looking toward a stage. Outside was a nearly forgotten settlement. Inside was a woman who continued performing. The story eventually became known far beyond the desert. Visitors came to see the unusual theater. Artists became fascinated by the building. Travelers discovered that one of the most unexpected cultural experiences in the region was hidden inside a place that most people would have simply driven past. The theater became a reminder that abandoned places do not always have to remain frozen in the moment they were forgotten. Sometimes one person can give an old building an entirely new purpose. Death Valley Junction had once existed because of industry. Later, it became known because of art. And that transformation is one of the strangest parts of its history.
The settlement had been created for practical reasons. The theater survived for emotional ones. People needed work to build the community, but one woman needed a stage to keep her dream alive. And perhaps that is why the story continues to feel so human. Most people have dreams they do not tell everyone about. Some dreams are too fragile to explain. Some are dismissed by others. Some seem unrealistic. And some survive only because the person carrying them refuses to let them disappear. Marta Becket's story became an unusual example of that determination. She did not wait for a perfect audience before creating something meaningful. She did not wait for a crowded town. She did not wait for the desert to become easier. She began with what was already there. An old building, an empty stage, a few walls, and an imagination powerful enough to fill them. Today, the Amargosa Opera House remains closely associated with the remarkable story of the performer who found an abandoned theater and transformed it into her life's work. The surrounding Death Valley Junction remains a stark reminder of how quickly communities can change when the industries that created them disappear. Accidentally, Wes Anderson. But the theater tells a different story. It tells us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is continue creating, even when nobody seems to be watching. Because the world may not always recognize what you are building. People may not understand your dream. The room may feel empty. The road ahead may look lonely. But an empty room does not mean the performance has no meaning. And a forgotten place does not mean nothing beautiful can happen there. In the middle of California's harsh desert, an abandoned community hall became a stage. A nearly empty settlement became the home of an extraordinary artistic legacy, and painted spectators filled the walls where real spectators sometimes could not. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson hidden inside the old theater. Sometimes the world may not be ready to see what you are creating, but that does not mean you should stop creating it. Because some of the most beautiful stories in American history began when almost nobody was watching.